Welcome to the Fundamentals of Project Planning and Management. My name is Yael Grushka-Cocaine, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to together learn some basic ideas and develop a common language around what it takes to plan and manage projects. Our course is developed and built over 4 weeks. Week 1 is titled Let's Get Things Started and covers all the activities that take place before we even start a project. Weeks 2 and 3, in gray on my screen, are associated with the planning of projects. Week 2 is titled Developing Plans, and Week 3 talks about a risky world. It's a risky world. In Week 4, the orange, Ready, Set, Go, we're going to be talking about the actual execution of projects. Let me give you just a little bit more detail on what we're going to cover in each one of the 4 weeks. As I said, Week 1 is all about the initiation of a project. How do we define it? How do we organize a project from the get-go to make sure that we're off to a good start? We're going to define the project goal, and we're going to think of 3 objectives associated with the project: the scope, the time, and the budget. We're also going to be very careful and identify the priorities that we have among these 3 objectives. Finally, we're going to think about the organization. Who are those folks involved in the project, affected by the project, and critical for the project's success? As part of Week 1, we're also going to take a little bit of time to look at successes and failures of projects that we think about. It will help us learn some lessons and make sure that we avoid any pitfalls that we can. Weeks 2 and 3, as I said, are all about the planning. In Week 2, we are going to develop a plan. We're going to start by scoping a project. How do we make sure that a project has the content and has the right set of activities that we would like it to have? We're also going to define dependencies and sequences of activities. What has to come before what? Ultimately, one of our main goals is to come up with a schedule. How long will it take us to execute our project? And we're going to learn some techniques in how to do that. In Week 2, we're also going to focus on the trade-offs. How do we trade off duration with cost and with scope in order to ensure that we are satisfied with the plan that we're putting forward, and in order to make sure that we have our key priorities when we come to make decisions during the project life cycle. Week 3, we're still planning. We're not quite ready for execution yet, and we're going to think about risk. We're going to assess the risks associated with the project, with the schedule, with the cost, even with the scope. And we're going to be cautious about how we can plan for ambiguity, how we can plan for uncertainty and ambiguity in order to make sure that we're not surprised during the execution. Finally, in Week 4, we're going to be ready to talk about executing projects. In order to really understand how to execute projects and how to make the most out of the project execution, we're going to be thoughtful of those involved in the project. Who are the individuals that are doing the work, and what kind of tendencies do they have? And how those tendencies might suggest a certain mode of execution. Should we use earned value analysis? Should we use a more agile approach, such as Scrum or Kanban? And how do these ideas come together in the concepts of our project, and how do they support the priorities and the goals that we set out to achieve with our project? Now, this is a fundamental course, and we're here to gain a common appreciation and a common language to anything or everything that has to do with project planning and project execution. There are a few topics that we don't have time or scope to cover in this course together. We're not going to cover exact certification process or study for a specific exam by one institution or another. And we're not going to become experts in using one software tool versus another software tool. There are many project management tools out there. We're going to hear about a few, but we're not going to become expert in one specific one. Another topic that unfortunately we're not going to cover here together is project portfolio management, project portfolio selection. But there is enough for us to dig into, and there is a whole lot that I'm excited to teach you over the next 4 weeks. So let's get going. Well, if you're like me, you might think of personal projects, like your school assignment or maybe a research project that you're engaged in. But these days, a lot of us also think about new product development projects. Let's look at a few examples. Maybe we think about the development of a new airplane, like the Airbus 380, or the development of a new car, like the Tesla. A project might be thinking about a drug development project from molecule to shelf, or maybe the development of a new personal device like the iPhone. We might also think about a project that has to do with putting up a website or a service online, like healthcare.gov. But some of us might also be thinking about mega projects, construction projects, landmarks that we think about and visit so readily. For instance, the Sydney Opera House, or maybe the pyramids in Egypt. We might also think about recent projects like London Heathrow's Terminal 5 construction, T5. Maybe the ongoing project that we might even go and see that is taking place in New York City at the site of the World Trade Center, the New York City's new transportation hub. These are mega projects. But there's a different type of projects that some of us might be thinking about. How about events or festivals? For instance, organizing something as complicated as the FIFA World Cup. Or maybe shooting a film from script to cinema. Organizing a festival for thousands and thousands of moviegoers to come and see, something like the Cannes Film Festival. That's a project. And finally, another example might be the production of a Broadway show. These are all great examples of projects. They're very different in nature. Personal projects, new product development projects, mega project construction projects, or events and performances. So what do they all have in common, and why are they all considered to be projects? Well, projects all have a specific and a unique aim, a product or service that they are going to develop. They are temporary. They have a specific start and a date and an end date. They have a temporary organization, temporary group of individuals who are engaged in that activity associated with that specific project. They require multidisciplinary coordination. Individuals with different set of expertise from different locations, all coming together for the purposes of that specific project. They're also constrained by time, cost, and resources. Let's look at a few formal definitions of what a project is. This will help us think about how do we plan projects, how do we execute projects, and what is the goal in project management. Here's one example of a definition from the Harvard Business Review. The Harvard Business Review talks about a unique set of activities meant to produce a defined outcome within an established time frame using specific allocation of resources. A slightly different definition comes from the Project Management Institute, where they talk about a project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product or service. We see temporary and unique. So if these are common traits of projects, and these are common features that projects exhibit, what is not a project? What around us that is not considered a project? Well, here's a few examples of things that we might want to think about that are not projects. The manufacturing process of a new car or of some type of clothing item. Those are not projects. Those are routine, ongoing operations. The routine processing of certain applications, such as insurance applications or job applications, are not projects. They are not temporary, and they do not have a unique set of individuals that come together for the purpose of that specific project. Why does it matter that we clarify what is a project and what is not a project? Well, there are several reasons why it's important. First, if we define a project properly, then we can find the correct tools to use when we plan and execute projects. In addition, projects and processes, they might have different objectives, and therefore we're going to measure their success on different criteria. Finally, all the projects have the feature that they are supposedly unique. They have certain traits that come with being unique and being temporary, and we can cater for those and we can plan accordingly. And so today we saw what common features all projects have, what is not a project, and why it is important to distinguish between the two. Well, we need to be thoughtful of how we define and organize it before we even start any aspect of the planning. We're going to talk about 5 aspects of the project definition. What is the goal? What are the 3 objectives? Scope, time, and budget? And what is the organization that we need to establish to get things going? Let's start with the goal. So what is the goal of a project? Well, typically we think about the goal as the higher level objective. What is that unique product or service that we're going to provide? Why are we even bringing the temporary organization together? And why are we even engaging in this activity? That is the high level goal. Then we dig in to perhaps the most crucial part of the project definition, which is defining 3 objectives. Project management gurus like to call this the holy trinity of projects: the scope, the budget, and the time. The time, as the name might imply, has to do with the duration. Over what kind of time frame are we talking about executing our project? By when does it have to be finished? The scope is usually a description of requirements, quality, specifications of a product that we are going to eventually deliver. And the budget has everything to do with cost and resources that we have available to us for the purposes of this project. Now, the reason it's called the Holy Trinity is because each one of these different objectives might pull in a different way. If we're limited by time and we really need to meet a certain deadline, we may need to think about giving up on one of the other 2 dimensions or the other 2 objectives, either in scope by reducing it or by finding more money to support an accelerated schedule. And so when we think about any project's 3 objectives, we always have to be thoughtful about the trade-offs and the priorities among them. One way you might want to think about this is to define which of the 3 objectives is constrained, is limited. We are definitely not able to exceed. Another aspect of thinking about the 3 objectives is if it's not constrained, maybe we want to optimize it. We want to achieve a certain goal. We want to minimize it or maximize it. And finally, where can we compromise? While we might have a specific time, maybe we can compromise and delay things. And so when we think about our 3 objectives, we want to map them out. Which one are we going to be constrained by? Which will we aim to optimize? And which can we compromise on? Let's take 3 examples on how we might think about these objectives and the priorities among them. Recently in the US was a launch of a service called healthcare.gov. Healthcare.gov is basically an exchange service online that allows healthcare insurance providers to be paired up with those who need healthcare insurance. When we think about a project of this scope, pairing up millions of individuals with thousands and millions of providers, the scope is probably going to be the domain in which we are constrained. We are limited by the scope, and we must meet those specifications. It could be that we have some room to compromise on the time. The exact launch date might not be specified in advance, and we can actually define it as we go along. And in this case, budget might be thought of as something we would like to optimize. Keep to the minimum as much as we can, given that we are constrained by the scope that we need to achieve, and that we have some room to maneuver in terms of the timing of when we launch the site, by when we complete the project. A different type of project with a different set of priorities might be a wedding. Well, one thing we know is when the date is set, the date is fixed. And so in a wedding setting or in an event, time is the constraint. The project must take place at a specific date. If your wedding is like mine, typically the budget is where you end up compromising. In order to optimize on your scope, to provide as many thrills and bells and whistles and to get that band that you really want by the constraint deadline. A third example, again, different domain, is how do we think about a project that has to take up new product development, build a new facility, and deliver a product to the shelf of a supermarket, for instance. In this case, a juice product. Start from an empty facility all the way to shelf. Well, in this case, the priorities are different. We are constrained by the scope in the sense that we need to meet the specifications associated with delivering a product that will be bought and consumed by individuals at a supermarket. We might be able to optimize on time and try and reach that shelf as soon as possible. The competition is fierce and we want our product out there as quickly as we can. And so the budget is where we are going to compromise, and we might need to end up finding additional investors or finding additional ways to support ourselves in order to get that product to the shelf by the designated time. So these were a few examples on how we might set about defining a project and how crucial it is to identify upfront which of our objectives we're going to be constrained by, where we can compromise, and what are we going to try and optimize. It's critical to think about these dimensions because the decision-making throughout the entire life cycle of the project, from planning to execution, will be governed by these priorities that we've set up front when we define the project. Let's talk a little bit more on how we might go about identifying the organization involved in our project and the stakeholders affected by it. We're going to see a few frameworks today, but let's focus first on a set of key questions that might help us think about the organization and the stakeholders. One natural place to start is to ask who will be doing the work. Will it be our own employees, or are we relying on external contractors? And if we are relying on external contractors, when exactly do they get involved? How much is under our control, and how much are we waiting on others? A second key question might be, who is the project manager going to be? Is he familiar with our company? Is he familiar with the employees? Is he new to our setting? We may want to consider who is paying for the project, who is funding the project, and when will those funds be available? Next, we'll think about the consumption of the project or the service. Who is going to be using the product at the end of the day? Who is our final customer? Finally, a key question might be, who else might be affected by this project? The general public, the government? How might they dictate outcomes related to our project? Another framework that might be helpful to think about when we think about organization and stakeholders is the stakeholder cycle. The stakeholder cycle has several steps to it, and let me take you through it step by step. After I do that, I will give you a brief example to make it more clear and to bring it to life a little bit. The stakeholder cycle starts by identifying all the stakeholders that are affected by our project and that affect the success of our project. We gather information about them and we identify their mission. We determine their strengths and their weaknesses, and especially we pay attention to how those strengths and weaknesses will affect our project and the success of our project. Then we might predict their behavior depending on alternative strategies that we might deploy, and we identify the strategy that we would like to incorporate into our project plan. I promised an example. Let's work through an example. Consider the project that has to do with developing a brand new cold press organic juice, the Lumi Juice Plant project. And so supermarkets might be a good example of a stakeholder, and especially let's think about an example such as Whole Foods, a natural food, organic food supermarket. Well, we gather information about them and we think about what do they care about? What is their mission? What is Whole Foods' passion? In this case, following the same example, this specific chain of supermarkets thinks about healthy eating, and they care about organic and making it safe for their consumers. Since we can determine, and it is clear for our project, that working and cooperating with Whole Foods and with this large chain of supermarkets will be key to our success, we want to make sure that we can find a strategy and that our project considers their mission. And therefore, we're going to predict what their behavior based on our certifications and based on the quality of our final product. And therefore, in this case, our project will have to include a proper process to apply for a U.S. Department of Agriculture organic certificate in order to comply with our stakeholders' mission. But this is just one framework that we might be able to use. Another framework that is very popular and widely used in project management today is thinking about a power interest grid. This framework was developed quite a while ago by Ed Freeman, one of my colleagues here at Darden at the University of Virginia. Ed talks about identifying where our stakeholders fall on two main axes, power and interest. Are they high power or low power, high interest or low interest? Once you've identified where our stakeholders fall, that will imply a certain strategy and a certain type of interaction. For instance, stakeholders that have low power and are low interest, we just want to monitor, make sure that there is no change. Similarly, stakeholders that might have high power and low interest, we would like to keep satisfied. And we would like to keep them satisfied because the outcome of them not being satisfied is critical and important to think about. If those stakeholders that have high power and low interest are not satisfied and they become high interest stakeholders, that is probably a signal to us that something is not going well with our project. And therefore, if we keep them satisfied, they will remain where they are at the low interest quadrant. Some of the key projects in history that we've heard of, large-scale projects that we know of that were not successful, typically fail on this idea of identifying their stakeholders and identifying their organization properly. An example from the U.S. is the opening in 1995 is the opening of the Denver International Airport. The airport is known to have been plagued by a series of problems. It opened 16 months late and it went $2 billion over budget. One of the fundamental mistakes that were made there, as we look back at history and analyze, is a lack of proper thought and proper plan for the different stakeholders involved. There were multiple parties and they were very different in nature. The project manager was not set up for success by not identifying the different interests that they have and their different power on the success and capability to affect the success of that project. From now on, when we set out to plan a project, we are thoughtful on the organization and the different stakeholders and their role in our project looking forward. Is that at the same time that project management techniques are developing and improving, failures are becoming more and more apparent and more common. Think about it. When have you recently heard about a successful project that was delivered on time, on budget, and met its specifications? It's not easy to come up with a few examples, but horror stories, they're everywhere. We always see these headlines. For instance, Boeing's shares plummet because the Dreamliner is delayed, again, for the 5th time. Or descends into a nightmare, repeated delays on its deliveries of its new product, its brand new airplane. Products routinely pull out and cancel their new developments because the project is unsuccessful. Or websites and services launch and routinely face a string of failures and disastrous service when their product becomes live. Finally, IT projects are notoriously and repeatedly reported to exceed their budget and to take too long. In fact, studies show that 1 in 6 projects grows wildly out of budget and out of hand. And so why is it that projects fail so often and so frequently? Well, there's a few factors or a few common reasons that we can trace and we can track why projects fail. And here are a few most commonly cited. First is little or no planning at all. There's no clear goal, no identification of the scope, and no estimated timeline. Second, lack of leadership and commitment by the stakeholders. We know that the stakeholders are critical for our success, and when we lack to consider them and they're not committed to our project will fail. Third, lack of training on new technology. We cannot expect a new technology to be an integrated part of our project without taking proper caution along the way. Fourth, we do not spend time learning lessons from historical projects and trying to improve and trying to incorporate them as we move forward. Next, we lack proper project management training. Very often, project managers are in their positions without ever taking a course or being certified or even knowing anything about project management per se. And therefore, lack of project management training is one of the key factors that leads to project failure. Finally, we are sometimes all subject to certain individual biases. We are optimistic about the future and we are overconfident in our own capabilities. We ignore or we are affected by sunk cost and we don't take them into account properly and make decisions in the moment as we should. And sometimes inertia and confirmation bias affects the way that we think about a project, and we continue to get involved with a project even though we should have terminated it and left long ago. So, how can we be successful with our projects? And what dimensions affect or might lead to successful projects? Well, one framework to look and to think about in order to try to ensure success will be 4 dimensions introduced by Aaron Shenhar and Dov Dvir. Shenhar and Dvir talk about 4 aspects or 4 axes that we might want to consider and map our project onto: technology, novelty, pace, and complexity. By thoughtfully identifying where our project lies on each one of these dimensions, we will identify the proper tools and techniques by which to manage our projects, and that will guarantee, or at least improve, our chances of success. So for instance, if we're about to begin a new project, And we've identified that this project, for instance, is low on technology. It's a low-tech project. And we believe that it is derivative in terms of its novelty, and that the pace in which it's required to hit the market is neither regular or blitz. There is some urgency, but it is not severe. And on the dimension of complexity, we rate it as moderately complex. Well, if we identify that and that is not correct, we will probably choose the wrong set of techniques and tools to manage our projects. And in reality, if it turns out that we were dealing with a much more complex technology and it was much more high-tech than we anticipated to begin with, then we are probably going to find ourselves failing to deliver on time, on budget, and within the scope. Another key factor that we need to think about is how are we going to measure the success of our project? Too often we would like to think about a project being successful if in 20 years' time it provided the revenue that we predicted and it was operational and still around. But that is not exactly how we define the success of projects. When we talk about a success of a project, we define it with respect to its objectives. And so we need to go back and revisit our project objectives. And so a successful project will be a project that is on time, on budget, and delivers the scope. We're going to ask, was it on time? Was it late? And by how much? Was it over or under budget? And by how much? Did it deliver its promised deliverables? Were the customers satisfied at the time of the project completion? Answering these questions will help us determine whether our projects are successful or not. One video describes a successful project. The second video describes a failed project. As you watched these two videos, try to think about factors that led to the one project to be successful and the other to not be successful. About two projects, one that was successful and one that was not. What are some factors that we can point to that led to the success or the failure of these projects? Check out the forums and the discussion boards to see what other folks have thought about and to enrich the conversation. In the meantime, here are some key factors that I've picked up on. Did you notice the passion that those involved with the Boyhood movie demonstrated? It was a personal project that the director cared about deeply. He brought on board stakeholders who he was familiar with. He worked with a studio that knew him well. He got his daughter engaged. And all the stakeholders, the small group of stakeholders, knew what the goal was, to shoot a movie over 12 years. It was a clear direction to success. On the other hand, Terminal 5. Today, a beautiful and well-run airport. But at the day of the launch, things did not go as smooth. Many different stakeholders involved, perhaps not all on board with what the objective was. Perhaps some underestimated how complicated the new technology was associated with the baggage handler. Maybe they didn't train enough or do some dry runs on how the system would operate given the magnitude of passengers that would go through the airport on the day of the launch. Reflecting on these types of projects and the factors that lead to the success or the failure can help us position ourselves as we approach a new project on the route to success. Project properly or planning it carefully. But sometimes it's important to stand back and to think about the entire life cycle of a project to know where we're coming and where we're heading to. So when we think about the project life cycle, we typically think about 4 different stages. Project life cycle looks like this. We initiate, we plan, we execute, and we close. In the initiation, we think about the organization and we define the project charter and we define the project itself. What is the goal and what are the objectives? When we plan, we identify the scope. We identify the tasks and their dependencies and we come up with a schedule. We plan the resources that will be needed throughout the project and we clarify different trade-offs among them and how decisions are going to be made throughout the life cycle of the project, throughout the execution of the project. As part of the plan, we come up with a risk management plan. How are we going to face risks when they emerge and where are they most likely to emerge? The execution stage of the project typically consists of monitoring how much progress is being made, communicating and reporting among ourselves on how well we're doing, and correcting and controlling if problems come up. What's important to think about during the execution of the project is that the monitor, communicate, and control are going to be a cycle. We're going to, on an ongoing basis, monitor our progress, communicate amongst ourselves, and decide how to correct and control. Finally, when all is said and done and we deliver our product, we will sign off with our customer or with our final stakeholder, and we will conduct a formal post-mortem. This stage is too often neglected and missed. What's so critical about a post-mortem is not only to list areas that might have gone badly or what we did wrong, but it's also to celebrate and to document what went well and what have we achieved and what have we learned that was useful and successful throughout the life of this specific project. Now, it's not that these different stages are going to be equal length in every single project. And in fact, different projects and the nature of a different project might imply a different balance between them. So if a new product development implies a certain time spent on planning and a different extent of time spent on execution, for instance, if we're working on a construction project, we may, if it's a routine construction project, putting down a new rail line, we might not need that much time spending on planning because we've done similar projects before. But the execution might be lengthy because of the physical work that is implied. An opposite example might be a wedding. We know that to plan a wedding takes a while, and we like to make it even longer. And so we will indulge and plan it over a long amount of time. The execution of the wedding, the day itself, is so short that it is a sliver of the length of time it took us to plan. Not only do we need to be thoughtful and think about how our different project might influence the length of time of these different components, but we also might need to be aware of the fact that it could be an iterative process. In some situations, we might plan and go back to our initiation and change our project definition. We might start executing and realize that we faced an uncertainty that we didn't anticipate and go back and make corrections to our plan. And so, by nature, the life cycle of a project could be iterative, and it's not that we're going to move sequentially between these segments. Some organizations, many new product development companies, like to take a broader look and stand back and think about the execution of a project in the context of a stage gate process. The stage gate process allows for reflection as we progress through the life cycle and as we progress in our development of our product. And so we might have a gate, an opportunity to reflect, to deliver a piece of work, and to have a decision made along the way. And we formalize it and we control the flow of our project as it matures and as we gain clarity on the content and on what the product will be doing. Regardless of whether you use the stage gate process or whether you use a different process, identifying the life cycle and acknowledging the fact that you may need to iterate between the different stages and taking into account and taking time to reflect on a project when it's done as part of your step of closing the project are crucial in our evolution and our improvement of the execution of our projects.